Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. As you can tell, I'm not in my ordinary office. I'm in a rather different office, the room where it happened on the 11th of November 1975, courtesy of the Governor-General, Sam Mostyn. So, you can probably tell that the room looks a little bit different today. Artwork would not have been the same. The desk itself is not the same. The original desk that was in the office when the dismissal happened has been donated to the Museum of Australian Democracy, so you can go and see it there yourself. This desk, however, is a desk that belongs to the House. It was used by the Queen in one of the other rooms further ahead. We believe, however, that the chair that I am sitting in was indeed Sir John Kerr's chair that he used at the time of the dismissal. So, although the room now looks a little bit different from what it did, you can still feel history hanging in the air here. We'll come back to me at Government House shortly, but before that, I need to outline what happened leading up to the dismissal. The 11th of November was the critical date because the Electoral Commissioner had advised that if an election was to be held before Christmas, then it had to be initiated on the 11th or possibly the 12th of November at the latest, with the poll being held on the 13th of December. Any later, and an election could not be held until late January. People often say that Kerr acted too early and he should have waited until supply completely ran out. But due to this timing problem, this would have dragged the crisis out for months with resulting economic chaos and damage, or it would have given Fraser an inappropriately long period of caretaker governance without a democratic mandate. The 11th of November was also the day that Whitlam came to the Governor-General seeking a half-Senate election. So Kerr was obliged to make a decision about whether to permit Whitlam to proceed with a half-Senate election without supply to cover the election period or not. He didn't really have the leisure to wait any longer. Kerr had in fact made up his mind on the 9th of November to exercise his reserve power of dismissal if no appropriate compromise was reached. It was only after he had done so that he consulted the Chief Justice, Sir Garfield Barwick. He was clear that he did not want advice as to what he should do, but what he could do, that is, the extent of his powers. He wanted Barwick to provide a written explanation of the existence and scope of those powers as a means of helping the public understand what happened if the dismissal were to proceed. But Kerr stressed that he didn't want to preclude the possibility of a compromise, so he asked Barwick to refer to the course of action which Kerr proposed to take unless a compromise was reached. As I've said before, I'll deal with the issue of judicial advice to vice-regal officers in another video, because I don't have quite enough time for it here. By the morning of the 11th of November, Kerr had all the documentation ready for Whitlam's dismissal, just in case there was no compromise. As Parliament was resuming its sitting that day, it was the last day for a political compromise to be reached. That morning, the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, and the opposition leader, Malcolm Fraser, met at Fraser's request around 9 a.m. Each side offered a compromise, which the other rejected. Fraser offered to pass supply if Whitlam would agree to hold a general election at the same time as a half-Senate election, or indeed a double dissolution, by June 1976. Whitlam rejected this offer, which would have seen him go to the next election as Prime Minister and with around 6 months to try to restore his electoral support. Whitlam instead offered to delay a half-Senate election until next year if the opposition passed supply. Otherwise, he said he would immediately call a half-Senate election and in the meantime he would govern without supply. When Fraser pressed him on whether he would seek supply to cover that election period, Whitlam responded that he would not accept supply. He thought that governing without supply and the social havoc that this would cause would instead put political pressure on Fraser. Fraser, however, warned Whitlam that the Governor-General might take a different view. Whitlam responded that that was nonsense. Fraser, after consulting with colleagues, rejected Whitlam's offer. Whitlam then phoned Kerr, the Governor-General, to tell him about the outcome of the meeting. He explained that neither compromise had been agreed upon and that he would advise Kerr to grant a half-Senate election later in the day. Kerr asked whether supply would be available to cover the election campaign. Whitlam said it would not. Now, this was the tipping point for Kerr. It meant that Whitlam was deliberately running a strategy of letting supply run out to cause economic chaos and blame it then on his opponents. However, Governors-General never grant elections without there being a guarantee of supply to cover the election period. And this is still the case. You can see it in every letter sent to the Governor-General asking for a dissolution. So you can see it in this letter from Scott Morrison to the Governor-General regarding the 2022 election, and this letter from Anthony Albanese regarding the 2025 election. Most relevant, however, was Whitlam's previous election, the 1974 double dissolution election. It had been called as a consequence of a coalition decision to block supply in the Senate, which was itself in response to Whitlam's attempt to manipulate Senate numbers during the Gough affair. When Whitlam first raised with the Governor-General the proposal to hold a double dissolution election, he had not yet secured supply. The then Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, recorded that he insisted that Whitlam give an assurance that he had supply to cover the election period before an election could be granted. He pointed Whitlam to relevant procedures as set out in Odgers on Senate practice. He authorised Whitlam to inform Parliament that the Governor-General would grant the double dissolution after provision had been made to cover supply. Whitlam would then have to return to the Governor-General with the supply bill once it had passed both houses so that it could receive royal assent. Only then could he make his formal submission for a double dissolution. And that's what occurred, as Hasluck indeed told the palace here. In contrast, on the 11th of November 1975, Kerr faced a request from the Prime Minister to grant an election, in this case a half-Senate election rather than a double dissolution, but without supply to cover the election period. To do so would have breached long-standing convention. Recent examples of governors applying that convention occurred in Victoria in 1945, 1952, and most recently in 1955, only 20 years earlier. Moreover, the chances of the election itself altering the Senate numbers to permit the passage of supply were, as previously explained, negligible. Even if the election had made a difference, given the Christmas break and the time taken to do the Senate count and to return the election writs and then to recall Parliament to sit, Parliament would not have been able to sit and pass the budget supply bills until probably late January, and that meant potentially months without supply. One constraint upon a Governor-General acting in such circumstances is that there needs to be someone else who can achieve the passage of supply and form a government. If that person does not hold the confidence of the lower house, then for democratic reasons, it will be necessary that their appointment be conditional upon A, achieving supply to cover the election period, B, advising an immediate election so that the government operates for as little time as possible without a democratic mandate, and C, the government operating in a strictly limited capacity as a caretaker government, taking no significant policy actions, making no significant appointments, and not exploiting its windfall gain of governmental power until it could be legitimately elected to office. On the 11th of November 1975, Kerr needed to be confident, before dismissing Whitlam, that Fraser would accept those conditions. While it remains disputed whether or not this occurred, it seems that Kerr rang Fraser later that morning asking him whether, hypothetically, he would accept such conditions if he were appointed as Prime Minister. Fraser apparently agreed. The appropriateness of such a call is also a matter of debate, as it would have given Fraser a strategic advantage of being aware of what might occur later in the day. Although this phone call, if it happened, occurred after both sides had already rejected the compromises that could have resolved the dispute, so it didn't actually influence the political choices that were being made. When the House of Representatives met that morning, Fraser moved a censure motion against the government for planning to govern without supply. Whitlam then turned that motion against Fraser with an amendment so that it censured Fraser instead. Whitlam was scheduled to go to Government House in Yarralumla to seek a half-Senate election immediately after speaking in that debate. The Governor-General's Secretary, David Smith, told Fraser to wait about 10 minutes until after Whitlam had finished before going to Government House. Whitlam, however, dallied a bit before heading to Government House rather than going there directly, and that meant that Fraser got there first and was ushered into the official residence at the front of the House. The Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, arrived just from over there through the private entrance because Prime Ministers had the honour, along with the Governor-General, of entering by the private entrance. Everybody else comes through the public entrance. Mr. Whitlam came along, sat down in front of the desk here and reached into his pocket to pull out the documents to advise the Governor-General to have a half-Senate election. The Governor-General, however, said, "Before you do anything else, let me say," and this is the words that Kerr later described himself as saying, he said, "You have told me this morning on the phone that your talks with the leaders on the other side have failed to produce any change and that things remain the same. You intend to govern without parliamentary supply." Whitlam said, "Yes." Kerr then replied that Whitlam needed supply in order to govern, and as he had failed to obtain supply, he was not prepared to allow Whitlam to continue to govern and that he would therefore withdraw his commission. Now, what the Governor-General had on the table in front of him was a piece of paper face down. He then presented that piece of paper to Whitlam, and this is the letter, which you can see here, that the Governor-General signed. And this is what it said. "Dear Mr. Whitlam, in accordance with Section 64 of the Constitution, I hereby determine your appointment as my Chief Advisor and Head of Government. It follows that I also hereby determine the appointments of all the ministers in your government. You have previously told me that you would never resign or advise an election of the House of Representatives or a double dissolution, and that the only way in which such an election could be obtained would be by my dismissal of you and your ministerial colleagues. As it appeared likely that you would today persist in this attitude, I decided that if you did, I would determine your commission and state my reasons for doing so. You have persisted in your attitude, and I have accordingly acted as indicated. I attach a statement of my reasons which I intend to publish immediately. It is with a great deal of regret that I have taken this step, both in respect of yourself and your colleagues. I propose to send for the Leader of the Opposition and commission him to form a new caretaker government until an election can be held. Yours sincerely, John Kerr." So that letter was handed to Whitlam, and he had a look at it. Then there's a dispute about exactly what happened next. On the one hand, we have Kerr's version, which said that Whitlam leapt up, looked around for the telephone, and said, "I must ring the palace." Whitlam, however, said that's not what happened. He said, "Have you consulted the palace?" And that Kerr responded by saying that I didn't need to, and it's too late, your commission has been terminated. Either way, both thought of the palace first in terms of responding to what had happened. But in reality, the Constitution puts those powers firmly in Australia. The palace itself wasn't involved and indeed didn't have the power to be involved at all. Both agreed that the meeting ended with Kerr saying to Whitlam, "We shall have to live with this." And Whitlam saying, "Well, if you will." But nonetheless, they both shook hands before Whitlam left. Kerr said that he thought that Whitlam could win the election and wished him luck as he left. Then, once Whitlam had left, Malcolm Fraser was called into the room and he was commissioned to form a government. But first, he had to accept some conditions. The key condition was that he obtained supply in the Senate. The second condition was once he had obtained supply in the Senate, then he had to advise the Governor-General to hold a double dissolution, which included all the bills that had been objected to by Fraser in the Senate, so that if Whitlam won the election, he could use those bills again in a joint sitting in order to be able to pass them. So that was a matter of fairness. And of course, making things go to an election was a democratic issue as well. The people ultimately had to decide. There were also conditions that Fraser could only operate as a caretaker government. And so that meant he couldn't make any new appointments, he couldn't make any new policies, and in particular, he was not allowed to conduct any inquiries into the Whitlam government and its actions, etc. So he really could only steady the ship and keep it going until an election would be held. And that election was going to be held at the earliest time possible, which was in December, so that the Australian people could resolve it then. So what happened next? And how did Whitlam respond? Not brilliantly, but better than others might have done. Paul Keating, who was the most junior minister in the Whitlam government at the time of the dismissal, and later, of course, Prime Minister of Australia, said recently in an interview with Troy Bramston that he would not have accepted dismissal if it had been him, and that he would have arrested Kerr. Keating claimed, quote, "I would have said, you are abusing a kingly power that was never yours to abuse. So therefore, you're seeking to illegally dismiss the government of Australia, which I regard as a criminal act, and I'm ordering the police to arrest you," unquote. Now, this just goes to show how profoundly ignorant leading politicians are of the Constitution, the law, and the scope of their own powers. First, the dismissal of the Prime Minister of Australia is not a kingly power. The monarch has no power to dismiss the Prime Minister of Australia. The power is conferred by the Constitution on the Governor-General, not the monarch. Second, ministers, including the Prime Minister, serve at the pleasure of the Governor-General as stated expressly in the Constitution. Now, while one might disagree with whether Kerr should have exercised this power at all, or at that time, he certainly had the legal power to do so. If there were to be any legal recourse for the exercise of the power, it had to be by way of a legal challenge to the validity of the decision in the courts. Although at that time, the courts were likely to have treated the matter as a political one, which is non-justiciable, meaning that the courts would not adjudicate upon it because there's no legal criterion by which it could be judged. Third, the Prime Minister does not get to decide that a power has been abused. An act is not a criminal act just because the Prime Minister decides to regard it as one. And finally, the Prime Minister has no power whatsoever to order the police to arrest anyone. The power of arrest can only be exercised pursuant to the law. Whitlam, in contrast, knew perfectly well that Kerr did have power to do what he'd done, and that it was extremely unlikely that it could be challenged in a court, which is, of course, why he didn't do so. But like Keating, who infamously described the Senate as unrepresentative swill, Whitlam was contemptuous of the Senate. He therefore didn't bother to tell his senators that the government had been dismissed, and thus he didn't give them the opportunity to consider what to do about the passage of supply. Instead of going back to Parliament House after his dismissal, Whitlam went home to the lodge to eat a steak for lunch. He did confer with some colleagues about moving a motion of no confidence in the new Fraser government in the House of Representatives. He just didn't think about the Senate at all. When the Senate resumed, most of the Labor senators were unaware of the government's dismissal. The Governor-General's press release about the dismissal was distributed to journalists in the press gallery at 2:05 p.m. The news gradually spread through the Senate chamber. While it's often claimed that supply was passed while the Labor senators were completely unaware of the government's dismissal, that's not quite right. The Labor leaders in the Senate were aware of the dismissal of the Whitlam government by 2:10 p.m, but were given no instructions from Whitlam's office on tactics. In the absence of any advice, they assumed that it was best to pass supply, so they moved the motion for supply at 2:20 p.m. That way, Whitlam could go back to the Governor-General with supply having been passed and a vote of confidence in Whitlam to be restored to government. The supply bills were indeed passed at 2:24 p.m. and the Senate adjourned. The House of Representatives voted no confidence in Fraser and confidence in Whitlam to form a government. The House adjourned at 3:15 p.m, so the Speaker could go to Government House to present this resolution to the Governor-General. Whitlam rang the Governor-General and indeed the Palace, as I'll talk about in a future video, to try to be reinstated by the Governor-General that afternoon, but he failed. This is where another of the red herrings arises. People often claim that a Prime Minister who is the subject of a vote of no confidence must resign or be dismissed. The convention, however, is that the Prime Minister must either resign or secure a dissolution. If he or she does neither, then dismissal is warranted. Fraser, of course, was commissioned on the condition that he secure supply and advise a double dissolution, which he did. There was no breach of convention on either Kerr or Fraser's part here, as long as Fraser sought and was granted a dissolution. But being careful about such matters, Kerr also took advice from the Secretary of the Attorney General's Department and the Solicitor General about what he could do in the circumstances. They confirmed that once having commenced this process of the exercise of the reserve powers, Kerr was entitled to proceed with it until its completion. While neither Byers, the Solicitor General, nor Harders, the head of the Attorney General's Department, thought Kerr should have dismissed the Whitlam government, neither considered that he lacked the power to do so, or that he lacked the power to complete the action by approving a double dissolution despite the resolution of the House. Whether or not Kerr kept the Speaker waiting or received him was really irrelevant in the circumstances. Kerr had the power to proceed with the grant of a double dissolution on Fraser's advice. In fact, the Speaker arrived at 4:25 p.m. and was kept waiting until his set appointment time of 4:45 p.m, but Kerr had already dissolved both Houses of Parliament at 4 p.m, so it was all over before the Speaker had even arrived. Some people ask why Kerr just didn't order an election and leave Whitlam as Prime Minister. The problem is that the Governor-General doesn't have a positive reserve power to order an election. The writs for the election, for example, can only be issued by the Governor-General in Council, and that means the Governor-General as advised by responsible ministers. The only way a Governor-General can force an election is by dismissing the government and appointing someone else to form a government who will then advise an election. Fraser did advise the Governor-General to hold an election for both houses, and the Governor-General accepted that advice. At 4:45 p.m, the proclamation dissolving Parliament was read on the steps of Parliament House by David Smith, the Governor-General's official secretary. This put the political issue into the hands of the Australian people at a full election for both Houses of Parliament. That election was held on the 13th of December 1975, with the coalition winning 91 seats in the House of Representatives and Labor winning only 36. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you enjoyed this very special episode coming to you from the Governor-General's office in Yarralumla and marking Remembrance Day, the 11th of November, 1975, which happened 50 years ago. Goodbye.